Welcome to Veritate with your host, Johnny Mack, a podcast that will dive deep into the pursuit of truth in a world filled with noise, confusion, and fleeting opinions. We will seek to uncover the eternal, unshakable truths that shape our lives and our beliefs, from faith and philosophy to history and culture. We'll explore the questions that matter, challenge the answers we've been given, and seek the wisdom that has stood the test of time. So join Johnny Mack in this journey to discover what's real, what's right, and what's true.
Welcome back to Veritate. This is episode 3, and I'm your host, Johnny Mack. So buckle up, because we're not just chasing the truth here. We're going to dig today through the rubble of history. We're going to claw our way to the bedrock of faith. No stone's going to be left unturned, and no question's going to be off limits. So we're going to dive into the fiery chaos of Jerusalem's fall in 70 AD, when Rome's legions torched the temples. And this fisherman by the name of Peter laid the first stones of the church 1,000 miles away in the empire's heart. And now this is not going to be some dusty textbook tale, okay? This is the story of fire, ash, and a divine plan that still echoes today. So let me set this scene for you. So Sunday morning, as I thought about what the next episode would be, I'm standing outside my church. I got a little cup of coffee in my hands, and I got the steam coming off this. I'm thinking about what should the next episode be. I'm trying to think through this logically. And as I'm standing there on the church grounds, our church has got plans to build a new church. And there's some markers out on the ground. There's some paint. And we've got it up inside of the church about the building plans that are going in, what we think it might look like. As I'm looking over the grounds, I'm seeing this formation of where this church might be. You got our pastor, he's out there, and he's talking about the dates that the contractors are coming in. He's got a committee that kind of goes over the details for it. He's got a bishop that's looming like a shadow. And then he's got us, the congregation, peppering him with a lot of questions like, when's it going to be done? What's next? And so I'm standing there looking at it. And I realized that this is the building of a church. And I thought, okay, I see this. You got to have a blueprint. You got to have a plan. You got to manage the circus, so to speak. And that seems to be a miracle in and of itself. But as I'm sitting there sipping my coffee and I'm watching the sunrise paint the sky gold, it hits me like a freight train that this is the story. Because that little site, that little construction site, is just a mirror of something ancient. Because 2,000 years ago, Peter had to face the same chaos, only the stakes that he used wasn't wood, right? They were souls. His blueprint wasn't just a building. It was the foundation of the church itself. And so just like our pastor, Peter has got to hold it together, or he'll watch it all collapse. Imagine this. If every contractor that we had that is going to be working on this project, imagine that they all go rogue on him. The electricians start to wire up whatever they want to. The carpenters slap up walls wherever they want to. The roofers cap a frame and it's not ready for that. And then what do you get? You get chaos, right? Total unhinged chaos. The whole project would implode like a pile of splintered dreams, right? Now I want you to take that image and then stretch that across history, because that is what Peter was up against. In Matthew 16, verses 18 through 19, Jesus does not mince words. He says, I will now call you Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Now that's not a pat on the back, right? That's a commission. That's a mantle of authority. Christ knew the stakes. Without a single voice, a steady hand, his message would fracture. Every apostle freelancing their own gospel, again, you'd have walls in every direction, all claiming his name, but no foundation. And the church wouldn't even have survived a generation if that was the case. But it didn't even stop there. That authority was not a one-time gift, okay? It was a torch, was passed hand to hand through apostolic succession. That's a new word for everybody, apostolic succession. From Peter to the bishops and the priests today. That's an unbroken chain. That is a spine of steel holding the church upright for 2 millennia. If you don't believe me, I want you to check out some of the writings of the early church fathers. Irenaeus in Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 3. He says that Peter and Paul founded the church in Rome. Also, Clement of Rome, in his first epistle circa 96 AD, it ties it back to Peter's leadership. So this isn't guesswork. This is history etched in ink and blood. Now here's where it gets wild. That structure didn't just save the church. It gave us the Bible. So before you ever had a leather-bound book on your shelf, there was a church. And it was guided by Peter's successors, sifting through scrolls, debating, and deciding, okay? So remember when I told you I was looking at how many Bibles there were, and I found that there were over 5,000 just in English, right? Just in English. The question that I had to ask myself was, where did we get the Bible from? Like, how do I know which one of these to pick up and read? And so I started digging in on where did we get the Bible from, and then all of a sudden I come across the Council of Rome in 382 AD. Under Pope Damasus I, he laid out the canon, which was 27 New Testament books locked in. Now, without that authority, the Word of God would have been a jumbled mess. It would have been scattered to the winds. More on that on the next episode, but I want you to consider this teaser. That before we had anything, wouldn't it likely be that somebody had to approve what book went in and what book went out? Like, who determined why is this book here? Why is this book next? Who determined that? We'll save that for next episode. So we got to jump back in here. We're going to jump way back. We have to go back all the way to 70 AD. Jerusalem at that time is a powder keg, and you got Rome about to light the fuse. So the air there, it is thick with smoke. You got the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is like the beating heart of Jewish worship. It stands defiant, but it is doomed. General Titus and his legions storm into the city, and it is carnage. The Jewish historian Josephus was there, and in the Jewish War, book 6, chapter 4, he paints a nightmare. Flames so fierce that the temple stones buckled and melted, blood pooling in the streets, the screams of the dying swallowed by the roar of collapse. That's not just a building fallen. That was the old covenant crumbling. And inside those walls, the Sanhedrin. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but most of my understanding of the Sanhedrin came from a lot of movies that I had seen. The Sanhedrin always seemed like they would show me in a movie anywhere, sometimes from 6 to 7 guys. Sometimes you might see a movie that has about 10. But even when digging into the Sanhedrin was 71 men, Pharisees and Sadducees. That was the council at the midnight trial that condemned Jesus. But even the Sanhedrin in this, they fractured under the strain of Rome. One of them in particular, Johanan ben Zakkai, he saw the end coming. According to the Talmud, in Talmudic tradition, he says he faked his death and he got smuggled out in a coffin and he begged Vespasian for a lifeline. And he opened a school in Yavna to preserve Judaism. So he made it there, but others were not so lucky. There was a group called the Zealots, okay? There was this militant faction. They turned the city into a slaughterhouse. They gutted anyone who dared to negotiate with Rome. When the walls fell, the Sanhedrin's power burned with them, either torched in the flames or cut down by Roman sword. So while Jerusalem's choking on ash, there's also something stirring up in Rome, right? Peter's there. Now, according to records, roughly around 60 to 64 AD, Peter's already in Rome. And that was before the temple's fall. And that's according to tradition and the historians like Eusebius in Ecclesiastical History, Book 2, Chapter 14. As the old order dies, he's planting a new one. Now, I want you to just think about the contrast. One city's in ruins and another one's rising. You have Tacitus, who is a Roman senator. He gripes in his book called The Annals. Chapter 44, he talks about this mischievous superstition called Christianity spreading like wildfire through the empire. Now, is that a coincidence? No. That's God's hand turning destruction into Genesis, right? Peter's not just surviving, he's building. In Rome, that's the empire's beating heart. He's carving out the church. Again, Matthew 16:18. On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Now, early Christians called it Catholic. That is a term that means universal or of the whole. That's a term that Ignatius of Antioch, he coined that phrase around 110 AD in a letter that he wrote to the Samaritans. Okay, chapter 8, he says, wherever the bishop is, there is the Catholic Church. From Jewish roots, it explodes outward, fulfilling Christ's command. Just as in Matthew 28:19, it said, go and make disciples of all nations, unified, unstoppable. So I'm going to take you somewhere personal again. As a Southern boy, right, I'm about 5 years old. Last time I talked about Mama, I would have to digress here and have to talk a little bit about Papa, because Papa, he was like sitting on a front porch. I'm about 5 years old. And as in most cases, a lot of the older men back in that day, they would sit on the front porch and they would whittle. Okay. He's got a knife in one hand. He's got a chunk of cedar in the other. And he's carving it into a duck. Now, I'm wide-eyed. I'm watching him do that. And I'd go over and I'm like, Papa, how do you do that? And he kind of chuckles at that. He says, easy, son. It's really easy to do. You just take a piece of wood and you cut away everything that ain't a duck. I'm 5 years old and I'm baffled by it. But now I understand it, right? Because that's what Peter's doing in Rome. He's chipping away the lies, the chaos, the doubt, until all that is left is Christ's truth. Solid as stone, right? So we're going to dig a little deeper. So Jerusalem's fall, that also was not random, okay? That was prophecy fulfilled. Jesus warned in Matthew 24, verse 2, he said, not one stone will be left on another. Now, I've heard the versions of it that talk about, he was talking about his body. You have to understand, Jesus didn't say he tells the truth. He says he is the truth. Everything in conjunction with him is true. The church, the shroud, I went through that, right? So when he said that not one stone will be left on another, that also was fulfilled when Jerusalem burnt to the ground. You can also go back and you can check Josephus again in his book, The Jewish War, chapter 5. He says that the Romans pried apart the temple's foundation, leaving nothing standing. But that's not the end either. That was the old covenant's physical heart. As it was collapsing, Peter's again in Rome, and he's building a spiritual one. Clement of Rome, in 1 Clement, chapter 5, says that Peter faced trials of martyrdom there. Tradition even holds that he was crucified upside down, around 64 to 67 under Nero. That's the rock that Christ chose. Okay. 64 to 67 AD, Peter is here in Rome. Now, I have heard people who have seen what is known as the seat of Peter, and they will always reference it has an upside down cross on it. And that upside down cross was put on there that represented that, according to the tradition, that when Peter was martyred for his faith and he was crucified, he did not want to be crucified in the same manner that Jesus was. He did not feel worthy to be crucified in this manner. And tradition holds that Peter asked to be crucified upside down. That's the rock. That's a man bold enough to die for the truth. And Rome, the empire that raised Jerusalem unwittingly, watered the church's roots by that action. Nero's persecution, right? Tacitus notes in Annals, in chapter 44, he said that this action only fanned the flames. The Christians began to meet in secret in catacombs beneath the city. Now, I want you to picture it, because even still to this day, there's damp tunnels, flickering torchlights. The bones of the martyrs are stacked along the walls there. In the catacombs, when someone was martyred for their faith, the Christians would take their bodies down into the catacombs. And there they celebrated the life of this person, okay? From it, we get this other Greek word. You will hear many Catholics use it. I don't know how many know that the term Eucharist is also a Greek word. It means thanksgiving. And the Eucharist is a ritual that is rooted in the Last Supper. You find it in Luke chapter 22, verses 19 and 20. The Mass comes from the Latin word missa. It means the dismissal, okay? It's not just worship, it's a mission. They broke bread. They remembered Christ's sacrifice, and then they went out to spread it. These early believers had no Bible, not as we know it, because the New Testament itself wasn't canonized until centuries later at councils like Hippo in 393 AD, Carthage in 397 AD, and that's according to Augustine's records. So what kept these people going? What kept those early Christians going? Oral tradition, apostolic teaching, and relics. Again, I am having to make a logical deduction. As my last episode was about the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo, and we talked about the carbon dating, we talk about the face that's on that, and we talk about the blood that was on that. It's still in the possession of the church today, correct? So I want you to imagine holding that cloth, which, by the way, Jewish law would have forbidden for them to have that. They would have been told their whole life, we do not hold anything of the dead. That is forbidden. But here you are in 70 AD. You have the shroud, the burial cloth, and the sudarium, okay? And depending on which version of the Bible, it refers to the sudarium. For anyone who reads it, you'll read a word, depending on the translation, it will say the word napkin, okay? But I want you to imagine in 70 AD, you look on this shroud and you see his face, you see that image, and you know that according to what these men say, he rose from the dead. Listen, that is the fuel for a faith that would stare down lions. Now, why does that matter? Okay. Because 2,000 years later, we are still standing on Peter's rock. So now, imagine it. Just below Rome in the catacombs, places where they could worship in secret and honor the relics that symbolize their hope in the resurrection. I read in some of the historical accounts, especially during the 1st and 2nd century, that Christians were so persecuted that it would not be uncommon to walk through Rome and see the bodies of Christians hanging up and being lit on fire, used to light the streets with them. Where would they have gotten the kind of faith with no Bible to be willing to endure that level of persecution? They didn't walk around talking to each other about what was written in the Bible. They got no Bible. Everything that they got had to come out of these meetings that were occurring in those catacombs. It's in these underground chambers, surrounded by the bones of martyrs and the relics of their faith, that the structure of what we call the Mass today begins to take shape. As I said, Mass comes from the Latin word missa, and it's derived. You hear this at Latin Mass. At the very end of the Mass, you will hear ite missa est. Now, that has two meanings. It means go, it is the dismissal, or go, the mission is sent. Now, over time, the word missa became associated with the entire celebration of the Eucharist. But the deeper significance of the word lies in its connection to the mission. The Mass is not just about worshiping God in a sacred space. It's about being spiritually nourished through the Eucharist and then sent forth into the world to live out the Christian mission. In essence, the Mass prepares the faithful to take the love and the teachings of Christ beyond the walls of the church and then to share that love with others. Faith, hope, and charity. Caritas in veritate. In the most profound sense, the Mass refers to both the liturgical celebration and the calling of the faithful to go forth and carry Christ's message into the world. The Mass is centered on the Eucharist, which commemorates the Last Supper, but the moment when Christ offered his body and blood for the salvation of humanity. In those catacombs, the early Christians would have participated in this liturgy. They would have connected the sacrifice of Christ with the sacrifice of those who were being persecuted for that faith. The Last Supper, as referred to in the Mass, draws a direct line from Christ's sacrifice on the cross to the liturgical practices of the early church. The early Christians, included those worshiping in the catacombs, understood that in the Eucharist they were participating in the same mystery of Christ's passion, death, and resurrection that the shroud and the sudarium both represent. The Mass, even then, was not just a memorial. Mass is not a memorial. It's a living sacrifice, a representation, but let me put the word correct, a representation of Christ's sacrifice on Calvary. Now, this profound connection would have strengthened the resolve of those early believers who faced death, knowing that Christ had already conquered it. They've seen the proof of it. And the use of Latin in the liturgy, which developed in Rome as the church grew, it added to the sacredness and the universality of the Mass, because what was the deal? What were they doing? They were trying to convert Gentiles. What's the language of Rome? What's called the vulgar language? It's called Latin, right? It's more than just a language of that empire. It became a sacred language that connected believers across regions. So as the Mass emerges from these catacombs and into the broader Roman world, that use of Latin helped to unify the church. It created a sense of continuity between the early Christians that were hiding in the catacombs and the growing church in the light of day. The Mass carries with it the weight of history, of persecution, of sacrifice, of the resurrection, linking us to those who worshiped in secret, just as the relics of the shroud and the sudarium link us to Christ's passion. Even to this day, in every Catholic church, in order for you to have an altar, there are relics that are inside that altar. And what are those relics? They're first-class relics. What are first-class relics? First-class relics are the bones of those that have been martyred for their faith. We're still doing what they did. When I look on the altar at St. Edward's, there are 4 of them. They're small relics, but it must be a first-class relic, meaning that it comes from the bones of those that have been martyred for their faith. Here's me, and I will admit that this is me trying to think through this. But my question, when I read of King Abgar V in Edessa, and I read of that history of the image of Edessa, the question I have, is it possible that King Abgar, that was in Edessa, modern day Urfa, Turkey, he had heard of Christ's healing powers, and he sends a messenger to request the image of Edessa. And in response to it, a member of the church at that time takes the sudarium that bears the face of Christ on it, is sent to Abgar. Abgar's been suffering from illness, and he believed that if he saw this image, it would heal him. The image of Edessa was traditionally believed to have been housed in the city of Edessa, where it became the symbol of divine protection of the city and its rulers. And so the cloth's miraculous origins and the association with healing, it made it an object of great reverence then, and for centuries it was venerated as a holy relic. Many legends and accounts attribute to the miraculous powers just to the image itself, including the healing of King Abgar. The image of Edessa became so important of a symbol of Christianity's divine power and the connection between Christ and the faithful. Now, the image of Edessa, however, was eventually taken away during a period in the 10th century when the Byzantine Empire rose and the city fell. Some of the sources I've found says that the cloth may have been moved to Constantinople, where it remained up until around 1204. And after that, the fate of the image of Edessa has become uncertain. Some people claim that it was lost. Others suggest that it may have been hidden or destroyed. But even despite its disappearance, the image of Edessa had a profound impact on Christian art. When you see images, for example, if you see an image of Christ's face and you see a beard, you'll see of Jesus where there's like a piece of his beard missing. Oddly enough, that artwork is incorrect. If you read through the Bible and some of the things that a Jew was not permitted to do, was not permitted to shave the ends of his beard. And so anytime you see this artwork, I found it strange that these images would have this piece of the beard missing. But it's not until you see the shroud, because the beard of the man in the shroud is missing a piece from the center. And again, that it reinforced my faith, because there's nothing in the Gospels that talk about the ripping out of Jesus's beard. We know from what is written in the Gospels that he was under the control of the Roman soldiers. And we do know that they put the crown of thorn on his head. They spit on him. We know all of that, but the shroud shows a piece of his beard missing. And that piece of that beard missing, while it's not in the Gospels, it is in the prophecy that we get from Isaiah. Because Isaiah prophesies about the Messiah, of how his beard is pulled out by its roots. I'm merely offering that perhaps that the prophecy of Isaiah and the image that is shown on the shroud of Jesus's missing beard also explains the reason why artwork for the people who saw the image of Edessa started to change how Jesus's beard appeared in the artwork. But the Catholic Church, from its very beginning, preserved and honored the physical evidence of Christ's life, death, and resurrection. The evidence would embolden the believer throughout history, just as the early Christians in the catacombs found strength in the relics and in the structure of the Mass. We too are called to see the connection between Christ's sacrifice and the Eucharist that we celebrate today. So the Mass, with its roots in those secret underground gatherings, they remain the linchpin of our faith. It unites us to the resurrected Christ and to the generations of believers who came before us. So why does all that matter? Because 2,000 years later, we're still standing on Peter's rock. Jerusalem fell, empires faded, the church endures, Catholic, universal, unshaken. In a world that's fracturing, look around, folks. It's 2025. Chaos is king. So look, I get it. I understand. You would say, Johnny Mac, you're suggesting that the Catholic Church is the church. And how can that be? For the longest time, listen, I won't go into my own history on this particular episode, but I didn't want that to be true. My first experience with the Catholic Church came from what the Catholic Church calls the Summer of Shame. And it was where the accusations against priests and altar boys, and I don't even have to go into all of that. You know what I'm talking about. You've heard of it. There's not a Catholic alive right now that if you haven't heard some joke in regards to the priest, the cover up, let's not forget the cover up that the bishops engaged in by moving some of these priests around. Like, I won't hide from the fact, because again, what did I say? Veritate. This is about truth. The truth is that a lot of the bishops who covered it up are just as bad as the priest who did those things. That's not even an argument. But now the question is, how could that be, John? With the bad priests and the bishops and even the popes, all of the history, and the answer still, I will tell you, lies in what Jesus said directly to Peter. I will now call you Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Jesus did not say that the church would be perfect because its members are flawless. He made a promise that the church itself, his church, would endure no matter what. That's huge. The church isn't dependent on the virtue of individuals. It is built on the truth of Christ. So even when priests, bishops, or even popes fail morally, the church itself stands firm because of the foundation Jesus laid. If his promise wasn't true, if the gates of hell had won, then Jesus couldn't have been the Messiah. But we know that through history and through his life, death, and resurrection, that Jesus is the Messiah. So I get it. What about all these sinners in the church? Does that discredit it? No, it doesn't. Jesus himself warned that there would be wolves among the sheep in Acts 20:29, and that the tares would grow alongside the wheat, Matthew 13, verses 24 through 30. So the existence of sin within the church only proves humanity's need for salvation that Christ offers through the church. The church endures despite the sin of its members because it's Christ's institution. It's not a human one. The Catholic Church was, and always will be, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, the institution founded by Christ. Its endurance doesn't rely on the personal holiness of any one person, but on the unshakable promise that Jesus made to Peter. And despite everything, failings, scandals, persecution, the gates of hell have not, cannot, and will not prevail against it. I'll break it down for you, okay? I've been poring over the history and laying it all out. And I don't care what church that you have. Remember, I counted 45,000 denominations, 40,000 non-denominationals. I started to dig and I would pull at the thread and I would just look at it and I would say, okay, who founded this church? And then I would go back and I would find a date of when this church was. And then I would look at another church and I would find a date and I would go back and I would find when it was founded. And every time I kept pulling at threads, I would always come back to a person's name at a particular date until I pulled at the thread of the Catholic Church. And I found out, just bear with me. Let's start from that foundation and we'll go through this quickly. And hopefully you'll be able to see the continuity. So 30 AD, Jesus founded the church. As I said earlier, he gave Peter the keys. He makes him the leader of the church. That's where it all begins. 33 AD is Pentecost. That's when they're in the upper room and the apostles start spreading the gospel, each speaking in a language. They establish the first Christian communities and they maintain this apostolic succession. Come forward around 50 AD is when the Council of Jerusalem happens. For those of you that have read it in your Bible, you remember that Paul was confronted with a question about circumcision, and he has to go back and ask Peter because even himself as a Pharisee, when he got asked the question, he didn't know how to answer it because the Gentiles had not been circumcised. The Hebrews had been. And so there was some incongruity here with should we or shouldn't we? He goes back, he asked Peter. He didn't ask all of the apostles, he asked Peter. Peter then calls the others, and then I'm going to take it down to this level, basically asking the other, hey, did Jesus ever say anything to you about this? Did he ever say anything about these? He makes a declaration that the Gentiles do not have to be circumcised. His authority from that stems from Jesus's last, as he's ascending into heaven, where he tells them that whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So it's that authority structure that he's able to make the first papal declaration. As the leader, he makes that declaration. And then all of the apostles teach the same thing after he makes that declaration. So that's called the Council of Jerusalem. 64 to 67 AD, Peter and Paul are both martyred in Rome. And that becomes the central authority of the church within Peter's martyrdom. So Rome becomes the central authority. Where is the Catholic Church right now? Where's the central authority? Still in Rome. What's there? The Basilica of St. Peter and the Basilica of St. Paul. So come forward from 67 AD, 313 AD, you have the Edict of Milan. That's when Constantine legalizes Christianity and the church's public presence grows. Then in 325 AD, you have the Council of Nicaea. That is where the Nicene Creed is formulated, affirming core doctrines like the Trinity. 381 AD, you have the Council of Constantinople, where the church reaffirms its teachings and its unity against heresy. Then 431 AD, you have the Council of Ephesus, where the church declares Mary as Theotokos, Mother of God. We'll do an episode about the Mother of God upcoming, but it reaffirms the authority of the church and its declarations. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. 451 AD, the Council of Chalcedon. The church defines the two natures of Christ, further preserving true doctrine. And then all the way up to 1054 AD, you have what's called the Great Schism. Okay, some say schism, some say schism. But the East and the West divide, but the Catholic Church still retains the apostolic succession and the papal primacy. And the East and the West are still unified today. This Great Schism occurred, and so now we do have Eastern and Western parts to the church. And up until 1517 AD, there was nothing else. 1517 is what marks the beginning of what's known as the Protestant Reformation. So those 45,000 denominations and the 40,000 non-denominationals stem from one event that occurs in 1517, and that's when Martin Luther nails his edicts on it. He's protesting, and I don't disagree with what Martin Luther was protesting. I disagree that you made the distinction of going away and establishing your own church. The Martin Luther Church is one built on Martin Luther's opinion and a protesting of the Catholic Church. But that was the first time in history that people broke away from the Pope's authority to form new denominations, denominating, right? So despite all of the divisions and challenges, the Catholic Church can trace its roots back directly to Christ. It is a living testament to his promise. So now, just as Papa Ross had said, that you take a piece of wood, you cut out everything that ain't a duck. When you cut out everything that isn't true, as Mama Margie used to say, a half-truth is a whole lie. And here on Veritate, we want the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help us God. So remember, the truth of Christ's church still stands firm, even in 2025, through all the trials and tribulations of history. I may not like that 2 + 2 is 4, but I cannot change it. As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. I'll see you next time. God bless you.
Thank you for listening to Veritate. If you would like to contact the show, please email us at veritate@yahoo.com. That's veritate@yahoo.com. Thanks again, and we look forward to hearing from you. May God bless you all.